Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Kent seminar. Today we have a very special guest. It's a little bit different than usual. Professor Colleen Murphy. She is the Roger and Stephany Joslin Professor of Law, Philosophy, and Political Science. She's also the acting executive director at the Illinois Global Institute here at UIUC. Her research focuses on the ethical dimensions of risk analysis and transitional justice. She had her doctorate in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I'm very excited because this is a different presentation than all the presentations we usually host at the seminar. And just please join me in welcoming Professor Murphy.
So thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm gonna I prepared some slides, so I'm gonna share my slides for now, and then come back into a mode where you can see me when the presentation is done. Okay, so the title of my talk is The Role of Transportation Infrastructure on the Impact of Natural Hazards. Now let me see if this is going to let me advance. Okay. And I wanted to give an overview of the parts that I wanted to cover in the course of thinking about that topic. And as indicated, it's going to be a little different, I'm sure, than what you're used to. So when I was originally invited to speak, it was with the thought that I could talk about engineering ethics. And so what I'm going to do first is just sort of briefly state what I take engineering ethics to be about, and how that will be informing what I say as we proceed. Then I'm going to talk about risk analysis for extreme events or natural hazards specifically, which is the context where I work with civil engineers most commonly. And then I'll introduce you to the idea of capabilities, which we've used in our work thinking about societal impact, and then turn to transportation infrastructure specifically and connections with capabilities. Okay, so when I'm talking about engineering ethics, one way to think about it is as a synonym for ordinary morality. So when you're talking about morality, you're talking about standards of conduct that you want everyone to follow. Even if everyone else is following them, means you would have to follow those rules too. So common standards of morality are don't lie or keep your promises. If you're following the hearings for the Supreme Court Justice nominee Jackson, Immanuel Kant has come up in the course of some of the testimony. He's a very famous philosopher who articulated this basic idea. But in addition to standards of conduct, another thing that ethics talks about is values, where when we're talking about value, we're talking about what is it that is worthwhile or has worth or is good, and so worth preserving either in itself or instrumentally. So for utilitarians, one school of ethical thought, pleasure or happiness is taken to be the only thing that is good in itself, that's worthwhile in itself. The only thing that's bad is taken to be pain. Virtue ethicists talk about virtue as being valuable, but there's these two different dimensions, one articulating what it is people ought to do, and two, thinking about what it is that matters or is worth preserving or worth promoting or having. And it's that second dimension of value that connects up most directly with the work that I'll be talking about in terms of risk analysis. When you're talking about, so one more kind of background note. So when you're talking about value or things that are good or worthwhile, or when you're talking about standards of conduct, when you're talking about ethics, you can do it from two different perspectives. One is a descriptive and empirical perspective, where you're trying to describe accurately what standards of conduct, for example, are taken to be or believed to be the standards of morality, or what is it that's valued for a particular community in a particular context. And that's what a lot of social scientific fields like sociology or anthropology investigate. So for example, you might, as a descriptive and empirical matter, talk about the fact that Americans value fame or value money, either intrinsically or because of what fame or money allow you to do. And you figure out that that's the case through things like survey or looking at what people talk about. So again, descriptive and empirical. My training in philosophy is not looking at ethics from that perspective. So it's not trying to, in the first instance, understand what people think is what morality requires, or what people think is valuable and important to protect, but rather trying to identify what in fact morality requires, or what is in fact valuable and worth preserving. So put differently, what are the standards of morality everyone should endorse, or what is it that people should value, even if in fact they don't? And so for philosophy, part of what we do is articulate standards for critically evaluating what it is communities take to be worthwhile, or the standards of morality that they endorse. So for example, you might advance an argument that fame in fact has no value, or is actively, has active disvalue, either in itself, or it doesn't actually lead to what people think it leads to as a matter of instrumental fact. So just trying to clarify, I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not interested in doing surveys. I don't do surveys or try to figure out what people in particular communities in the first instance care about, but what is it rather we ought to care about. And we can talk about how you argue for that, but I just wanted to make that clarification before going on. Okay, so that's part one, kind of, the domain in which I work is the domain thinking about what it is that that has value, that is worthwhile, that is good, that we ought to be interested in promoting or protecting or preserving, as well as standards for conduct. So then the question is, so how does that interact with what engineers do? And so here's an entryway into thinking about that. So risk analysis is something that engineers engage in for extreme events or natural disasters, and do so because of the significant consequences that events like earthquakes or droughts or floods have for communities. So looking at a UN report, in a 15-year period between 1991 and 2005, almost 1 million people were killed and 3.5 billion directly affected by these natural disasters. And there's wide recognition that they can be devastating in certain cases, not always, but some of them can be for communities. And so I list some of the consequences from the Haitian earthquake that was absolutely devastating from 2010. So given the significant impact that disasters can have on communities, it's important that communities be able to understand what it is they can effectively do by way of mitigation to prevent some of the worst consequences from being realized, or at least reduce the probability that those consequences will in fact come about. And this is where risk analysis enters in, where risk is understood to be a set of scenarios and their associated probability of occurrence and consequences, and where through risk analysis, what you're trying to do is specify those probabilities, predict those potential consequences, and then evaluate the risks that you've been able to assess, and develop mitigation strategies based on an accurate understanding of what the risks in fact are. So my project, in collaboration predominantly with Paolo Gardoni in civil engineering, has been to try and think about the conceptual and ethical questions that risk and risk analysis raise. And in particular, in the first instance, think about which consequences matter in risk analysis. So historically, engineers have adopted an approach to thinking about what consequences you want to capture in risk analysis by focusing on what it is that you can measure. And that's easily quantifiable, that captures resources lost. So for example, number of buildings damaged, costs of the buildings that were lost or damage to buildings that were not completely lost but were damaged to some extent, number of fatalities, and try to come up with a number of the value of a human life, direct economic losses stemming from disruption that natural disasters generate. But this kind of what are the resources we've lost, and what is it we can quantify in terms of especially monetary loss, has some important limitations. And one of them is that it doesn't directly provide us a lot of the measures that we look at with how that translates into impact on individual lives. So for example, damage to a particular structure can have greater or lesser impact on the lives of particular individuals or communities, depending on what the structure is for. If it's a hospital, or if it's an empty vacant building, or if it's an apartment complex that's fully occupied. Secondly, so there's a gap between assessing certain measurable losses and being able to infer what that means for how particular lives of individuals and communities are impacted as a result. Secondly, this kind of approach doesn't provide a principled way to think about what losses should count or are salient for purposes of risk analysis. So ease of quantification isn't a principled guide to thinking whether you've gotten or captured everything that matters or is significant in understanding the societal impact of a natural hazard. And finally, monetary measures of loss can overlook ways in which market valuation can itself entrench inequalities that are morally troubling. So if you think about loss of property and how property valuation can track inequalities in communities, then you can say that the loss of a building for a poorer socioeconomic family is less significant than the loss of a similar residence for a family that has more resources and is able to live in a wealthier area, even though in both cases, at the end of the day, lives are affected in the same way, namely by the loss of housing that should matter equally, or shouldn't prima facie be treated in such an unequal manner in the way that market valuation implicitly does. So to try and move beyond thinking about these limitations to how engineers have often approached this question of thinking of consequences when it comes to risk analysis, Dr. Gardoni and I turned to the idea of capabilities. So this is an idea that was articulated by philosopher Martha Nussbaum and development economist Amartya Sen in the context of thinking about how we ought to measure development of communities. So and I'll talk about this in a moment, but the United Nations every year publishes a UN Human Development Report that is trying to capture the standard of living or how well lives are among individuals in communities across the globe. And part of what Sen did from the economic perspective is say that assessing development or levels of well-being on the basis of GDP, on the basis of gross domestic profit of a country, is misleading and insufficient at a minimum, because it doesn't tell you anything about how that overall GDP is distributed. So you can have communities with a large GDP, but where most of that is held and owned by a very small percentage of the population, and the majority of a population doesn't actually live very well. And it also doesn't tell you what people can do with the money that they have. So this is kind of what he calls the interpersonal conversion rate, but how far particular resources that individuals have takes you is going to be a very context dependent thing. So think about healthcare in the context of the United States, where there's no centralized system of healthcare. Satisfying basic health needs depends on a significant amount of resources, many more resources that are needed, for example, if you live in a country like Canada. And so again, the inferences that you can draw based on knowledge about the amount of money that an individual has is going to be somewhat limited. So instead, Sen and Nussbaum said, what we ought to be thinking about and trying to, what we're really interested in is understanding what genuine opportunities are open to individuals within a community to do and become things of value, or to achieve valuable states and activities. Things like opportunities to be educated, or to be healthy, or to be mobile, or to participate politically in the institutions of your community if you so desire. And that in opportunities, these opportunities to do or become things of value, in turn depends on two general kinds of factors: what an individual has and what an individual can do with what he or she has. That should have been underlined too. So Sen often will use the example of mobility, where to assess whether an individual is mobile can depend on, in part, on looking at what an individual has, a car or a bike, individual income to pay for gas in the case of a car, the skills and knowledge to use either a car or a bike. So my 8-year-old son has a bike, but we haven't yet, much to my chagrin, taught him how to use it. So it's not much of a resource for mobility for him right now. But in addition to looking at what an individual has, you have to also look at what an individual can do with what he or she has. Where here the condition or presence of roads or of bike lanes, where roads go relative to where an individual lives and where an individual wants to go. Social, gender, and legal norms. So if you're forbidden as a woman from driving a car, knowing how to do it, and having income to pay for gas and a car as well, won't be conditions sufficient to enable you to be mobile. So too, if you have a car and know how to use it, but legal, according to the legal rules, you can't drive until you're 16 and you're 14 years old. So a variety of different kinds of factors. So Sen and Nussbaum, but Sen in particular in the context of trying to measure things, said, it's not just an idea we're going to promote. This is what we're interested in looking at. We also have to think through, well, how do you measure this? How do you assess capabilities? And there's a complicated story about that. Often what is being assessed is actually achievements and not opportunities that you might not have taken advantage of. But setting aside that complication for a moment, this just gives you an example of how it is within the Human Development Index that different kinds of opportunities have been assessed. So for example, if you want to assess the ability of individuals in a community to live a long and healthy life, one measure or indicator of that is life expectancy at birth. And you can then, from if you have different numbers of life expectancy in different communities, then you can begin to investigate, well, what is the factors that explain the differences that you find? Is it a function of differences in what individuals have? Is it a function of differences in what individuals can do with what they have? But it provides some measure of what individuals are able to do in that particular case, or opportunities for being knowledgeable. So to look at adult literacy rates or gross enrollment ratios in school to get some measure of education in a particular context. Okay, almost done, because I know I wasn't supposed to go past 35 minutes, and I think I'll go more like 25, so we have time for conversation. So what Paulo and I have been trying to do over the last few years is bring the idea of capabilities into the context of engineering risk analysis. So when it comes to trying to understand the impact that a particular natural hazard can have on communities, societal impact, define that impact at the most basic level in terms of how it affects genuine opportunities open to individuals to do and become things of value, where you focus on the particular kind of opportunities that hazards characteristically affect. So here looking at how shelter can be disrupted, being able to be sheltered, or being able to be educated, being able to be employed, being healthy. When you in looking at the literature on how lives have been disrupted, sort of identifying at the most general level what those disruptions are, the opportunities that are characteristically affected, and then try to predict how hazards will affect those opportunities by looking at the disruption to infrastructure of particular kinds. The built infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, I know will be of interest to you, coupled with information about, at the more individual level, that shapes, to use language from the social sciences, the different vulnerability that individuals have to being affected or to have opportunities disrupted as a result of the way that infrastructure is affected. So what does this look like? I'll give you a brief example of how we've tried to implement these ideas in the context of transportation. And I'll just say now, for all of the more technical details, I will defer to Jessica Boyacki and Roberto Guidotti, who are both PhD students in civil and environmental engineering, who have now gone on. Jessica is an assistant professor and Roberto works for a risk analysis firm. And Paolo, so I'm just going to give you the big level ideas, but this is published in Reliability, Engineering, and System Safety. So our starting point is the idea that transportation, this is not unique to us, has as one of its main functions supporting accessibility, right? It's needed to connect people not only to each other, but also to places of interest, such as workplaces or schools or hospitals. And of course, it's widely recognized, again, this is not unique to us, that transportation infrastructure plays a key role on the impact of hazards on communities and their recovery, because impairment of transportation infrastructure can impair first response efforts or evacuation plans by requiring either alternate or longer routes. It may lead to individuals becoming disconnected and so unable to reach the destination that they desire. And even after immediate impact, when we're looking at the kind of more recovery stage, may continue to prevent people to return to their normal activities if they're unable to reach their workplace or school or et cetera. So these sorts of, there's recognition that these impacts can happen. But what we found in terms of how you think about trying to measure or assess this, that the costs to repair infrastructure or measures of disconnection and isolation don't by themselves tell us the cost of impact, don't by themselves tell us how that cost to repair in the meantime impedes the opportunities of how many people open to do what specifically. Because to understand the cost of impact, we need to understand what individuals are not able to do any longer if transportation infrastructure is damaged in particular ways. And so the goal of the paper was to try and provide a methodology to be able to assess the impact of transportation infrastructure precisely on the ability of individuals to be sheltered and mobile, educated, and earn income specifically. So the first step in the paper was sort of identifying the capabilities of interest, which are the ones that I just laid out. Then we tried to identify information at the census block level, and even more detailed than the census block level itself about the population of interest within which a particular transportation infrastructure was located in terms of income and age of people, where people were located in terms of where they lived and what their occupation was. And then when it came to a particular capability like having shelter, used income as a proxy for whether individuals located in a particular space would need to go to shelter in case there was damage to the particular place that they lived, on the assumption that higher income families were likely to have alternatives to shelter, or to needing to avail themselves of emergency shelter that they could utilize in the case that their particular place of occupation was damaged. Couple that with engineering models that can predict where damage will occur. And then for the subpopulation of interest, those that need shelter and for whom dislocation would be particularly problematic, look at transportation dislocation to see who wouldn't be able to access shelter given damage to infrastructure, as a way of trying to assess broader impact, and then did something similar when it comes to the other capabilities of interest. So I will stop sharing my slides there, but hopefully that gave some overview of what it is we're trying to do and how it is ethics informs engineering, not just in the sense of shaping norms for professionalism, which is what a lot of engineering ethics courses focus on, and rightly so, but also can inform engineering decisions about what you think matters to take into account when you're thinking about where infrastructure is needed and for whom it is needed, or what kinds of disruptions in the case of risk analysis matter to communities, and then go on to try and assess those. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Murphy. I'll be taking questions from the room, and Egemen will help me with the chat.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions to Professor Murphy?
I have a question.
Yes, well.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor, for the nice presentation. My question is about one of the starting slides in which
Sure.
you started with the descriptivist versus prescriptivist, I think.
Yep.
My question is, for ethics to move to laws, do we have to have a strong prescriptivist ethical background or like foundation for us to, at the end of the day, say who bears the risk of a decision that is made?
Good. So your question goes to the heart of two courses I teach. One is in the law school, one is called jurisprudence, and the other one is torts. So jurisprudence is, the whole course is about the relationship between law and morality. And torts is specifically about who bears risks, right? Given that all of our actions are risky with, potentially lead to the infliction of losses on others, which losses come for as wrongful losses, and who ought, when, in what cases does the person who's responsible for inflicting a loss bear responsibility for bearing those costs? So that question speaks to me. Let me go to the question of law though. So we can look at law from exactly the same two perspectives that I was articulating with respect to morality or ethics. So when you take a class like torts, which is one of the first year classes, it's the doctrinal classes. So you take torts and contract law and property law. What you're studying is what the law in fact is, right? What constitutes negligence in the American legal system, where there's variations across states, but you're understanding kind of basic principles that shape who's allowed to recover damages and for what. So part of the course is trying to articulate what the underlying rationale is, right? What it is tort law takes itself to be doing, because there's a lot of policy considerations that are built into the law that we have. But again, that's studying it from a very descriptive perspective. You can also then study the question of what should the law be, right? Take a more critical perspective, trying to understand, is it fair, for example, the conditions that need to be met for someone to be able to recover from someone who's responsible for inflicting losses on them, right? And argue that the American legal system is too restrictive in its understandings of the losses that ought to be eligible for recovery. So when it comes to the law, you can adopt either a descriptive or a prescriptive perspective, and both have value, right? If you want to avoid lawsuits, you better know what the law is. But legal thinking shouldn't stop with what the law is, but should also be oriented towards making the law better in areas where it needs improvement.
Any other questions?
Hello, Professor. I have a question regarding the last part of the presentation.
Okay.
I'm wondering what is the decision-making index that's coming out from all of this? Like, how do we assess which risk or which hazard is more
Right.
risk for a community? Is it the change in HDI or what is it?
Good. Yeah, so part of what you're trying to do is at a first step, you want to get a picture of impact, right? And you can make a comparative assessment. How bad is this impact relative to the impact of other hazards? But yeah, the first step is trying to get a picture of what kind of losses of opportunity are we talking about? And then the next question of, so what should we do in response, right? Does this call for mitigation? Answering that is going to be complicated and depend on a number of different kinds of factors. So one kind of factor, trying to think about one kind of factor is whether or not there are certain kinds of losses. This is drawing on some work that Paolo and I have done, that should be judged to be sort of unacceptable in principle, right? So are there certain kinds of losses, certain kinds of inability to access temporary shelter, for example, that ought to be judged unacceptable for individuals to find themselves in, even in a temporary sort of situation. So one kind of question could be in looking at the nature of the consequences and how bad they are, and whether they call out for immediate mitigation action because they're sort of in principle unacceptable for a community to leave its population potentially subject to. But a lot of consequences might not be that severe or significant. You're looking at losses, but they're bearable, they're tolerable. And then the question of what ought to be prioritized by way of mitigation, I think doesn't have one single straightforward answer. So it may be that parts of the community are disproportionately affected in a number of different ways by a potential hazard. And so the priority for mitigation ought to be focused on a particular geographic area, right? Poorer communities might suffer in a wide variety of ways, not only from the loss of shelter, but absence of mobility. So there might be distributional considerations of fairness that lead you to focus on prioritizing attention to mitigation in a particular geographic area. Or it might be that there are judgments that certain kinds of losses of opportunity are worse than others, right? Mobility might be judged absolutely essential because it's a condition for the possibility of other things that matter, education or employment. So I think that there's going to be a number of different considerations. Cost is also a moral consideration. Thinking about how can you most efficiently utilize resources in order to most effectively mitigate potential impacts that are there. So part of the input that you get from any sort of understanding of how lives are going to be affected, to put it in one way, right? How opportunities are going to be curtailed. It's supposed to be an input that provides the basis for exactly the kind of further debates and considerations that your question generates. But I don't think there's a single straightforward answer. I think there's many considerations, some of which that will be contextual, that are going to shape what is it all things considered. That's a phrase that's often used in philosophy. There are many considerations. All things considered, what is it best to do in a particular case?
Well, I do have a follow-up
Sure.
question. Omitting the unacceptable risks that you mentioned.
Yep.
Can we at this point quantify the loss of opportunity to prioritize budget allocation, or are we too far from that?
So I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very last part of your question. Could you repeat that?
So I'm wondering how are we going to quantify loss of opportunity? Because right now, it seems like if we quantify loss of opportunity, it's just going to lead to prioritizing where there are more people. If we use this capability approach to allocate budgets and to decide on mitigation strategies.
Yeah, so not necessarily, I mean, so you're right that there's a respect in which the magnitude of loss for a particular opportunity will be greater. If you're thinking about shelter, if there are more individuals affected that you're taking into account than when there are other kinds of opportunities that affect less numbers of people. So in that sense, from a sheer magnitude perspective, you're right, that will push in the direction of addressing the opportunities that affect more people, but not necessarily. I mean, part of the value we think of the capability framework is that you might think not all opportunities are equal, in the sense that not all are equally critical to maintain at all times. So it might be that health, for example, has health as negatively impacted by being injured, has a certain kind of normative priority, even if it's only a smaller number of people who are being affected. The fact that you're critically injured has a kind of normative significance that trumps other kinds of impact that affect larger number of people, but aren't as pressing in the first instance to address. So part of the debate that we're hoping to generate, especially if you disaggregate different kinds of opportunities that might be affected, and you're exactly right to bring in the magnitude question in terms of that, it's going to be complicated what follows, because you've got to think about the values that are at stake and the opportunities that are at stake and the arguments to advance for why, even if more people are affected, certain kinds of consequences don't matter as much as others. So lots of people might be affected because they aren't able to watch their favorite television show, right? Millions of people are affected. I'm taking a trivial example, right? Magnitude, quite significant if you take into account all the numbers, but intuitively it doesn't matter as much than dealing with the needs of people who are severely injured, even though from a numbers perspective, that's less. You can think about weighting capabilities mathematically to try and capture the sort of relative importance, and so blunt the perspective that sheer numbers has. And here I defer to all of you engineers who work in the more mathematical, there's mathematically ways you can build in this differential valuation. But part of what we want to make explicit is the valuation that needs to be made, right? If you think you shouldn't just be looking at sheer numbers, but it also matters how people are affected, then that requires you to think about what kinds of impact are more pressing to address, or are more, have greater loss than other kind of opportunities that still might matter that we preserve, but just not in the same way. So does that help? Does that address the question you had?
Yes, thank you.
I see we have a question from Ahmad in the chat. Ahmad,
Okay.
do you want to ask your question?
Okay, from what I understand, so I'll read this out if you all don't have it. From what I understand, starting from a Kantian ethical account, you investigated the moral obligation in the case of natural hazards. My questions are, what moral imperative do you think transportation policy in the US and public policy in large follows? Small question. And shouldn't it be a priority to make transportation that provides people with the means they require to reach the ends in their daily lives? Yeah, okay, good. So Omar, you're going down exactly the line of thinking that Paulo and I want to urge. So I'm going to punt your first question of what moral imperative do you think transportation policy in the US and public policy at large should follow? I take it to be I'm going to punt a very detailed answer to that question for two reasons. One, I don't know enough about the details of transportation policy in the US to be in a position to speak very authoritatively on where the gaps are. But I can say at a very general, at a certain level of generality, what the second part of your question is pointing to is what we think that policy ought to prioritize. So when you're thinking about where you build transportation infrastructure, part of it will be oriented towards what is it people need to use infrastructure, transportation infrastructure for? Where is it people are located and who is it that's whose opportunities are being curtailed by either the design or the location of transportation infrastructure as it currently exists? So the thinking that you're articulating at the end of your comment about providing people with the means they need to reach the ends in their daily lives, that's exactly what we're trying to urge, to think about transportation and all infrastructure and not just infrastructure as a tool that ought to, in the best instance, be able to expand the opportunities of people to do what they value, and that is valuable. And viewing transportation and other infrastructure in that way is a way of trying to then ask questions about what ought policy look like, how ought transportation infrastructure be designed, where is it inadequate as it currently exists, et cetera. So hopefully that answered or touched on the point that you were raising.
Yes, thank you very much.
Are there any more questions for Professor Murphy?
I think there's one in the chat.
Oh, there is another one in the chat. Professor.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you mind reading that out?
Oh, sure. Okay. So yeah, isn't very helpful for you all. Okay, so this is a question that says, given that there are specific design standards that are recognized for liability reasons, but may not be adequate due to climate change or advancements in technology or community considerations, what action do you suggest that governments and stakeholders take in order to implement newer standards that may mitigate future risks, but may pose significant short-term risks for general contractors in transportation? So I mean, in one way, that's the million-dollar question. So when I teach about ethics courses, some of them touch about the ethics of climate change. And one of the dilemmas, one of the moral philosophers that we study points to is the way in which, and it's in line with what you were articulating in your question, but kind of democratic decision-making is fundamentally in tension with responsible planning for climate change, because the temporal horizon against which politicians are assessed, 4-year windows, and how did our lives change within that window, incentivizes action that's actually not conducive to dealing with the broader global challenge that we face in terms of effective responses to climate change. So the structure of the problem that you're articulating, how do you get government to act responsibly, knowing that longer term responsible action can have very significant shorter term costs not only politically, but also economically for general contractors. So I don't have, I don't have a complete answer to that question, but I think one place to start that Paolo and I we have a couple edited volumes that have come out, one on climate change and its impacts, and one on risk analysis for natural hazards, that are bringing together engineers and social scientists and philosophers and lawyers to think through policy questions of the kind that you're asking. I mean, so one place to start is, in the context for engineers specifically, is to update existing models, right? So I know in the context of risk analysis for natural hazards, there's a lot of move to try and incorporate and update models in light of climate change and how climate change affects the kind of affects natural hazards, both in terms of their frequency of occurrence and severity of impact. And so, you know, kind of starting to revise the models with which engineers work in light of climate change and advancements in technology. And then a lot of public policy, when it's responsible, requires lawyers and government officials to work in collaboration with engineers, to think about what's feasible. And here, you know, the perfect can sometimes be the enemy of the good. So sometimes, you know, the perfect policy from the perspective of dealing with climate change might not be either politically feasible or the best policy, all things considered, given the short-term costs. So I think one thing, you know, responsible dialogue and public policy formed in collaboration with the stakeholders who know kind of the specific respects in which design standards are inadequate, and stakeholders who know kind of the structure of tort law as it currently exists, and the sort of basic principles and standards that shape liability in the American legal system, to think about where revisions are possible. And I know that's abstract and not very satisfactory, but it's kind of where it is conversation needs to be happening, and with whom, in order to try to make some progress in answering these really hard questions. I mean, so I guess another way of putting it, you know, I deal with in my other line of work with transitional justice, which is just responding to massive human rights violations, where all sorts of fraught, complicated questions about liability and responsibility and arbitrariness and choices of who gets recognized and who gets held to account are present. And part of what you can do when thinking ethically is thinking about principled compromises and choices. This is a paper I have about what kind of balance of countervailing considerations, in this case, climate change with respect to contractors who are going to complain that their treatment is unfair because they're held to a standard that wasn't operative at the time that they were acting, or they didn't have due notice from. How you can find a compromise that does deal in some measure with climate change, and also the other kind of political feasibility and other moral considerations that are going to be relevant in that process. So didn't mean to give such a long-winded answer, but you know, the upshot of a lot of moral theory is it's complicated. And so the best way you come up with answers is through argumentation and analysis. Come up with a particular policy prescription, give me the arguments for it, give me the arguments against it, and then think about what other possibilities are present and the pros and cons in favor of those, all things considered. And in particular, from our perspective, thinking about how lives will be affected both in the short and long term.